Welcome to your Chapter 6 video. This includes everything in Chapter 6 except for biomes, which is going to be covered in class through our biomes gallery walk. So let's go ahead and get started. The first two questions that you have to do with the zebra mussel. You should already have some background knowledge on this because it was a part of a writing exercise that we did in class. The zebra mussel is originally from Eurasia. It is an invasive species that came over in the ballast water of ships from Eurasia to the Great Lakes. Ballast water is water that is drawn into the ship to lower it in the water and keep it stable as it goes across the ocean, in this case the Atlantic Ocean. And then once it gets to its port, it ejects that water so that the ship rises out of the ocean enough so that it meets its the deck of the port, the gangplank. It kind of all goes together because when the ships come in, they're lower than the place that they need to be to offload their the stuff in their ship. All right, so anyway, when it drew in the water in Eurasia, it contained the larvae version of the zebra mussels, and so those can live for days or weeks within the water, and then it was ejected into the Great Lakes where they've caused a humongous problem. List one pro and one con to having the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. The pro is that it makes the water clear so underwater plants and algae could grow, leading to entirely new ecosystems. Remember, evolution, extinction, these are not value-loaded words. They're just a part of the way that nature works. The cons are destruction of the current ecosystem that was based on the cloudy water. Cloudy and quote-unquote dirty does not mean bad. That's just the way that it was before. Clogs water intake pipes. You can see right there on the bottom of the slide a intake pipe was completely sealed shut because of the zebra mussels that were growing within it. There are a lot of businesses and residential areas that depend upon the Great Lakes for their source of water. You can see there on the right hand side that area is completely covered with zebra mussels. That is one of the issues with this being an invasive species, is that it being R-selected and having no natural predators, it just goes nuts. These things are tiny. They're really no bigger than the nail on your thumb, and you can see there on the left hand side someone's got some in their hands kind of for reference. Here you can also see that they will attach themselves to anything, including other living organisms. You can see here on the right hand side a crawfish completely covered, well not completely, but mostly covered in zebra mussels, and you can imagine that they can eventually glue their gills shut and actually kill them. Here on the left hand side was a shopping cart that was pulled out of the lake that was completely covered by zebra mussels. And here you can see one of those, the pros again is that you do clear out the algae and water clarity dramatically increases, but remember that there are lots of organisms that depended upon that cloudy water in order to do their thing. The thermocline, you don't know what that is yet. We'll talk about that another time. What are some other things that happens? It depletes the population of phytoplankton. So things that were depending upon that algae and phytoplankton to live, they end up dying. And then this also outcompetes the native bivalves. The zebra mussels have kind of taken over that niche. All right, and zebra mussels are no longer just a problem in the Great Lakes. Do be aware of all of the waterways that are connected to the Great Lakes are now infested with zebra mussels. So that is another issue with invasives, is that they just continue to spread. All right, ways in which species interact. This kind of sets up a lot of the following questions. We have competition, predation and parasitism, mutualism and commensalism. This is a really nice handy chart on the interactions between the two species involved in these particular relationships. So I suggest that you come back to the slide if you're having issues understanding the differences. Okay, name the relationship between multiple organisms seeking the same limited resource. That's called competition. What is a relationship called when it is between organisms of the same species? That is intraspecific. So when we play bubble soccer, and it's the teams come from within our school, that is called intramural. Okay, interspecific is between two different species, and so if we were to play bubble soccer against, let's say, Ida Baker, that would be intermurals. That would be between two schools. So intraspecific, that's within one species. That's when you have two white ibis competing over eating the same frog. Interspecific would be if white ibis and great blue heron were going after the same fish. Then these are other species interactions. Again, we're going to get to those in a second. So, what are three things that can happen if two organisms are going quote-unquote head-to-head for the same resources? One species can go somewhere else, one species dies out, which is called competitive exclusion, or the two species can subdivide the niche. That is called resource partitioning. Okay, so we're still kind of on question 3 here. Okay, this also says evolution takes care of this all long term. So you can see what happens here. A species goes somewhere else. Evolution is a part of that. Species dies out. That would be extinction. Two species subdividing a niche. Resource partitioning, that can lead to what's called speciation. Those two species can eventually end up becoming their own, or those two populations, can become their own species through sympatric speciation. Okay, competitive exclusion, we've already seen this with, they're called anoles. They're the little lizards that we have here. Dude on the left is the native green anole. Those are the ones I played with when I was a little girl. They were everywhere. Now you see the dude on the right. That is the Cuban anole, which has basically almost completely driven our native little lizard into extinction. It has outcompeted this one for its resources. All right, resource partitioning is where you take what normally you could, let's say these 3 different types of birds could feed on anything in that tree, and they end up going to the part that they like the best and staying there so they don't go extinct. Now please understand, these birds did not have a meeting and subdivide the niche. They just retreated. Organisms don't like fighting because a fight can lead to an injury, which can lead to death. They don't have neosporin, they don't have band-aids, they don't have an all-night emergency room. If you get hurt, there's a very real possibility you're going to die. So you do everything you can to avoid a fight, unless it's absolutely necessary. So that's where resource partitioning comes into play. These organisms just happen to prefer different parts of the tree, and this is just the way it worked out. Now, here is something else to consider. How do some other organisms subdivide their niches in ways other than just space? Hawks and owls is an example. Please realize you can partition a resource via time of day. Hawks hunt in the day, owls hunt at night. This is actually addressing question number 5. How can two species make adjustment over time using the same general resource? Again, that's called resource partitioning. Give an example of this process. You can see these 3 different types of warblers have done that with a tree. If you want to consider time, hawks and owls have partitioned the same forest depending on what time of day or night they hunt. Rhinos and giraffes partition their resources based on what they can reach. Giraffes can reach the top stuff, rhinos can reach the bottom stuff. All right, so fundamental versus a realized niche. This is what happens during resource partitioning. A fundamental niche is the set of conditions under which a species might exist in the absence of interactions with other species. In other words, what are all the places that an organism can live? Realized niche is a more restricted set of conditions under which the species actually exists due to interactions with other species. So this is where resource partitioning comes into play. And you can see right here that this is 2 different types of barnacles, and the barnacle that's colored red can exist in all of the places between high tide and low tide. But when this new barnacle, the one that's kind of colored blue, comes into play, it shrinks its niche to the higher tide portions because this blue barnacle outcompetes it in the lower areas, but it's the red barnacle's zone of tolerance allows it to live a little bit higher. Now, going back to this real quick, you can go from a realized to a fundamental niche if interactions with other species allow you to. So not only is this true of resource partitioning right here, this is also true of predator-prey relationships. White-tailed deer have a constricted niche. If predators go away, they may start reaching out to their fundamental niche, which is, those are also sets of conditions that can then make it invasives. So please, as you're starting to hear these new terms, think about how they fit into other stuff. How does this fit into carrying capacity? How does this fit into speciation? How does this fit into all of the other things that we have talked about? All right, character displacement is not one of your questions, but it is vocabulary word number 8, so I do expect for you to know this not on the quiz, but for the next test. Character displacement is when you have different phenotypes within a species, and you start having that disruptive selection going on. Remember, where 2 or more traits in a population become favored because of variable conditions. And here you can see that the different phenotypes are driven by the type of seeds that are available. These 2 guys up here up top. So if small seeds are only available in one area and large seeds are available in a different area, if the characteristics separate these populations long enough, this can end up leading to speciation. So character displacement is when the actual characteristics of an organism shift in one direction or another, or perhaps in 2 different directions, based on the realities of their niche. You can see that these types of birds, this bird right here, the A and the B, these are subsets of the same species, can handle 2 different types of seeds. It just depends on what type of seed is available from year to year that drives the character of the overall population. All right, so your next question, question 6, is going to take, the answers are going to take place over a lot of different slides. Be able to define and give examples of the following terms: predation, predator, prey, parasitism, parasite, host, herbivory, mutualism, commensalism, allelopathy, and then also question 7, how do predators and prey influence each other's population over time? That is going to be addressed over the next multiple slides. Okay, so predation. You have a relationship between predator and prey. Predation can benefit the prey. How come? Because the weak and those that are not very well suited for survival are weeded out by the predators, that are the easy ones to catch. Apex predators, I don't believe that is one of your vocabulary words, but you need to know what I'm talking about. Those are top of the food chain dudes, like alligators, sharks, and raptors. Raptors being birds of prey, they're the ones with the sharp talons and the beaks that can tear. Okay, predatory strategies. This is where some of these words come into play. Herbivory is just where herbivores just walk up to their prey. It's a special kind of predation. Deer are predators. They're predators of grass. And unfortunately, the grass can't exactly do a whole lot. But how can plants fight back? They can fight back by tasting terrible, by being poisonous, by having thorns, by not having a lot of nutrition in them, or through something called allelopathy, which is where they're actually toxic. Usually allelopathy is when they wage chemical warfare on other plants to keep them from growing, but it can also be when they're waging chemical warfare on something that's trying to eat them. Poison ivy is a great example of allelopathy. All right, predatory strategies for carnivores. They use pursuit, ambush, camouflage, and chemical warfare themselves. So let's look at these pictures here. Here up top, you can see that great white sharks use a lot of speed to go after harp seals, and also to go after sea lions. I don't know if those are harp seals. I take that back. I think those are sea lions. Lower right-hand corner, that is black widow spider. You see these here all the time in Southwest Florida. They will pop up in garages on occasion. They use their webs and their bite to subdue their prey. Lower left-hand corner, I don't know if this is jumping right out at you, but this is a boa constrictor. We now have these in Southwest Florida. And it uses camouflage and then also constriction to kill its prey. All right, prey just don't sit around. They use a lot of different strategies. They run. They have very acute senses. They have armor, breakaway parts. Think about tails on a lizard. Camouflage, chemical warfare themselves. They are poisonous. They are irritating, foul smell, bad taste. There are some animals that when they play dead, they actually exude a scent that makes them sound like they're rotting. Did I say sound like rotting? Smell like they're rotting. Warning, coloration. We're going to talk about the mimicked coloration in a second, and then deceptive looks and behavior. Here in the lower left-hand side, this is actually a caterpillar that when it is threatened, it flips its butt out and inflates it, and it ends up looking like a snake. Here on the bottom is a gazelle. They run incredibly fast. Lower right-hand corner, that is a monarch butterfly. It feeds on a milkweed that is toxic, and it builds up that toxin within its own body, making itself toxic. So, let's see, what terms have I not gone over so far? Predation is when one organism eats another. Predator is the organism that does the eating. Prey is the organism that gets eaten. All right, herbivory is predation or parasitism by the vegetarian species. And allelopathy is chemical warfare waged by plants. And again, it can be poison ivy. It can be any sort of plant that you try and eat it, it's toxic, like milkweed. It can also be something like Australian pine, which is invasive here in Florida. It produces needles that allows nothing else to grow underneath them. They're very acidic. The black walnut is another classic example of something that is allelopathic. You can see there on the left-hand side all the ways you can be allelopathic. And then you have the manzanita, which is a tree of the chaparral pictured above that is also allelopathic. You can see underneath it nothing actually grows. Anytime we bring up a term and I do a for example, you need to memorize an example for everything. So please keep that in mind. All right. E.O. Wilson is the most famous biologist living right now. And so there are a lot of sayings I'm going to throw at you, and here's one. E.O. Wilson says, if it, being an organism, is small and strikingly beautiful, it is probably poisonous. If it is strikingly beautiful and easy to catch, it is probably deadly. And that is true of these two guys right here. Lower left-hand side, that is a coral snake. I don't think that this is the version that we see here in Southwest Florida, but it is toxic nonetheless. It has a neurotoxin in it. These things are very easily handled. Usually when you see people dying of a coral snake bite, and it is a neurotoxin rather than a protein-based toxin, which you see in all of our other poisonous species here, works incredibly quickly and is very hard for the anti-venom to work against. Anyway, the times that you usually see these things being a problem is young male, 22, after a long night of partying with friends, is like, hey, watch this, and then ends up dying in the woods because a coral snake bit it. So they're easy to catch, easy to handle, but when you upset them, they're going to bite you and you're going to die. Lower right-hand corner, that is a poison arrow frog. Very easy to catch. I know they look like rubber toys, but incredibly toxic. All right. One of your questions, how do predators and prey influence each other's populations over time? We did the wolf and hare activity. You absolutely saw this happen. They control each other. This is the classic example. One number goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. What kind of cycle is this called? This is a cyclical thing. Happens periodically. One population shoots up and so the other one does, and then one population goes down and the other does. We don't know what causes these spikes. We know that it happens over regular intervals. All right, here is what a lynx is. It's a kind of cat, and there's a snowshoe hare there on the right. If you're wondering why it has this brown bit on its forehead, one of its prey strategies is, again, not that it thinks about this, evolution led to this happening, is in the summertime it is brown like the dirt that it's on, and in the wintertime its fur comes in white. All right, there are 3 kinds of symbiosis you need to know about. Any relationship when 2 species live closely together. There's parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. If you look at these 3 slides, there's an example of each one. Lower left-hand corner, flea on a person, that would be parasitism. Here in the middle, this is an epiphyte, a kind of air plant. You already know what this is. Attached to a tree, that's a commensalism, doesn't hurt or harm the tree. Air plant needs this for survival. And then mutualism is exemplified in the lower right-hand corner by the flower and the bee. The flower gets pollinated, the bee gets nectar. All right, Parasitism, a symbiotic relationship that benefits one species while harming and possibly killing the other. It's a special kind of predation in which the predator is much smaller than the prey. And it's also a special kind of predation where the predator, being the parasite, really doesn't want to kill its host, which is the thing that it feeds off of. Some parasites live inside, some live outside. Sometimes parasitism is not about feeding, sometimes it's about reproduction. It forces the host to raise its young, or the young feed off of the host body. So sometimes crossing over predation. Let me go ahead and talk about the second one here. There's a kind of wasp that subdues spiders and then lays its eggs in the spiders. When the larvae are born, they feed on the paralyzed spider. This right here, forcing the host to raise its young. Oh shoot, I don't have that slide. That's a shame. No, it's coming a little bit later. I'm going to return to that. My apologies. All right, so Commensalism is a symbiotic relationship that benefits one species and neither helps nor harms the other. Lower left-hand corner, this is a ghost orchid. Lower right-hand corner, this is also considered commensalism. Coral snake is right here. That is when the danger colors, please do not try and remember, by the way, the red touching black, friend of Jack, whatever. Instead of doing that, back away and then try and remember what it is. The way I remember it is the venomous snakes, the danger colors touch. So that would be the red and the yellow colors are touching, which is the eastern coral snake. We have something here called a scarlet king snake, where you can see the danger colors are separated by black, not venomous at all. This is a commensalistic relationship because the scarlet king snake takes advantage of its coloration to say, hey, I'm toxic, really? All right, bye, when it's not really. Coral snake doesn't even know these things exist. Okay, here's another version of commensalism. This is a remora here on the left, attaching itself like the world's worst goatee to the shark on the right. Here's the way it's commensalistic. Shark doesn't even know it's there. The remora uses the sucker on its head. It is actually a mussel, so it attaches itself to the underside of the shark. Shark is feeding. Remora disengages from the shark, eats the leftovers, reattaches itself, and they both move on. All right, another kind of symbiosis that we haven't talked about is mutualism. That would be where both of the organisms benefit from what's going on. This is often the result of coevolution. This is one of your vocab words. We're going to talk about it more in a second. A good example of that is lichen. Lichen is, I believe, one of your vocabulary words. It is vocabulary word number 27. It is a mutualistic relationship between an alga and a fungus. Absolutely know what that is. All right, here we go. Coevolution. Coevolution is where one species' evolutionary path is modified by the evolutionary path of another one. And a good example of that is acacia trees and ants. Acacia trees you see in savannas, and you can see that acacia trees have developed hollow thorns and then these little sugar pores that exude sugar water, essentially. These ants are now specially adapted to live just in acacia trees, so the ants get shelter and a place to live and a food source, and the acacia trees get basically the world's best burglar system. If somebody tries to steal any of their leaves, the ants are really not happy about somebody eating on their home, and they come out in force and drive the invader away. So that's what all of this talks about here. All right, coevolution and parasitism. This is what I was talking about before, when parasitism can be about reproduction. Breed parasites in birds. Bird populations lead host birds to count eggs and abandon their nest when there are too many present. So the parasite learns to throw out an egg when it lays one of its own in the nest. Then the host learns to throw out different looking eggs, at which point the parasites with matching eggs have a greater survival rate, which leads to the evolution of parasites laying eggs that match those of its host, and so on. So there's a bird called a cuckoo bird that does this, but there's also a cowbird. And you can see that the cowbird goes into a nest, quickly pushes out the eggs, as many eggs as it's going to lay, lays eggs incredibly fast, I mean like within minutes, and then it leaves. And you're like, hey Morris, clearly these eggs are different because they're bigger. Haha. Birds are pre-programmed to take better care of the larger eggs. From an evolutionary standpoint, that usually means a more vigorous young. And you can see at some point, these cowbird eggs actually also hatch faster and will end up pushing either the eggs or the young of the other native warblers out of the nest. And usually the first one will even push out the other cowbird eggs, leaving this giant cowbird chick to be raised by the warbler. And what's really funny about this is the warbler, again, is pre-adapted to really respond to this huge chick and thinks, yeah, look at this big baby I made. So this becomes very problematic. And if you're wondering again why all these bans are on this warbler, this is an endangered species, largely in part to the cowbird is invasive, and its range is spread to the point that it's wiping out this particular type of warbler. Other possible examples of coevolution and parasitism, that would be this says developing resistance to disease. It should say developing resistance to antibiotics leading to selective reproduction of new disease mutations. Actually, I guess that also if you as a person develop a resistance to a disease, then that means that new diseases will also pop up. But that's also true of antibiotics. All right, sorry, moving on. Coevolution in predators and prey. If a mutation crops up that leads organisms to survive a predator attack, these organisms will be preferentially selected to survive, leading to a new defense mechanism in prey. Predators can then go through the same process to overcome new prey defenses. Here's an example. Blue jays and monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies develop the ability to withstand milkweed toxins, and they build them up in their system. So young blue jays don't know about this, and so they eat monarch butterflies, become violently ill, and you can see vomit them right back up. Here's what's happening. Most of the toxins are concentrated in certain areas of the butterflies, so blue jays are learning to discard those and start to eat the non-toxic part of the butterflies. All right, finally we are moving on to the next question. So, what other things do we have in here? Sorry, I'm trying to catch up with my own slides. All right, question 8 says, review the following biology terms by identifying what they mean and giving an example of each. Producers, autotrophs, consumers, detrivores, and decomposers. So, let's go ahead and look at these slides. Producers are autotrophs. They bring new energy into the system. Consumers are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, and then decomposers close the loop. Here's the difference between decomposers and detrivores. Detrivores are actual animals like insects, everything up to vultures that scavenge dead bodies of other community members. Decomposers are strictly fungi and bacteria that break down leaf litter, and other non-living matter further into simple constituents that plants can use. All right, here are some examples. So trophic level 1, those are the producers, the autotrophs. Trophic level 2 is going to be a primary consumer of some sort, so an herbivore. Trophic level 3 and 4 is where the carnivores and or omnivores come into play. And remember I talked about apex predators? Apex predators are always top of the food chain dudes up here. They're the last link in the food chain. All right, here again is another example. Please feel free to pause this video if you need to. Here's another one. All right, so I said for you to not worry about oceanic food chains, but I did just want to kind of quickly talk about food chains and food webs. I'm not going to test you on this right now, but oceanic food webs are incredibly complex, which is what makes them very stable. Let me just go ahead and jump down to question 10. Understand what a food web is and why the arrows point in the direction they do. Arrows indicate energy transfer rather than what eats what. And food webs show all of the different things they can eat, because this food chains are very misleading. And then they're like, only this thing only eats this thing, only eats this thing. No. Most things have a wide variety of things that they eat. The more interweavings that you have in a food web, the more stable that particular web is, because if you knock one of these things out, it's not that big of a deal. However, if you look at something like this with the harp seal, the discussion becomes what happens if the harp seal gets knocked out. All right, so question 9. On average, how much energy is transferred from one trophic level to the one above it? That would be 10% of the energy. That means 90% of it is used in either upkeep or is lost as heat. And how does this explain the number of producers versus the number of tertiary consumers in any given area? First of all, that means you've got to have a ton of producers to support the dudes up top. And then also remember the energy is going to run out after about 4 steps because, again, you know, the first law of thermodynamics, energy can neither be created nor destroyed at some point because energy is lost. According to the second law of thermo, as you move up the food chain, at some point it's going to stop. All right. Question 11. What is a keystone species? First of all, you need to know what a keystone is. And a keystone is the stone in an arch that allows you to, once it's set, pull all of the supports away. You can see somebody here built an arch out of packed snow. And you can see that they needed supports up until they put the keystone in, and then the tension of that whole system kept it up. This is an ancient Roman building technique. But again, if you remove that keystone, the whole thing falls apart. So keystone species are, despite perhaps their relatively low numbers, or what looks like an unimportant position in the food web, if you take them out, the whole thing falls apart. Okay, they are, you can be a keystone species for niche services that have nothing to do with eating or just simply your place in the food chain. Here are some examples. The American alligator, the sea otter, beavers, sharks, and bees, bats, and birds. We're going to talk about what trophic cascades are momentarily. So, keystone species is a species that has a strong or wide-reaching impact far out of proportion to its abundance. The impact can include trophic cascade feeding habits, which we're going to talk about in a second, or habitat-altering behaviors like alligators and beavers. All right, let's go ahead and talk about alligators for a second. So, alligators are a keystone species because adults eat fish, snakes, turtles, mammals, birds, and amphibians. They lay between 20 and 50 eggs. Although the eggs and hatchlings are guarded by the mother, they still are a food source. But then also it's because of these gator holes. During the dry season here in Southwest Florida especially, these gator holes can be the only source of water for miles. Gators dig these holes for themselves and guard them jealously, which means that things that live in here have enough water to eke through the system, plus other organisms in a wide-ranging area have a place where they know they can come get a drink. All right, what is a trophic cascade? A trophic cascade is when predators at high trophic levels indirectly promote populations of organisms at low trophic levels by keeping species at intermediate trophic levels in check. This is a classic example. Sea otters eat sea urchins. By doing so, they keep the sea urchin numbers in check, which means the kelp forests that all of these other critters live in stay in place. If sea otters go away, which they did at one point, sea urchins come back in a hurry, and they love eating little kelp plants. So if they come back, they eat baby kelp plants, and this entire ecosystem completely vanishes. So this trophic cascade would be if sea otters went away, sea urchin numbers went up, and thus the entire kelp forest ecosystem, these are located off the coast of California, by the way, completely disappears. We are going to watch this video in class. All right, so ecological stability, we are going to differentiate between resistance and resilience. Resistance is when an ecosystem remains stable despite any sort of disturbance. An example is an ecosystem that resists the introduction of an invasive species. Resilience is an ecosystem changes in response to a disturbance, but later returns to its original state. An example of this is the regrowth of any sort of savanna or a forest after a fire. So we're going to go over this other stuff down here at a later time. Okay, resistance. So, for example, these palm trees are in the midst of a hurricane. They absolutely will look untouched when the hurricane passes through. Over here, resilience, there's been a forest fire, but immediately you can see these pine trees are growing back. As a matter of fact, pine trees do not actually, the seeds do not come out of the cones until after a fire. And that scorching is basically what activates their germination. All right, differentiate between primary and secondary succession. So, primary succession is the growth of Climax community from bare rock over hundreds of years. A climax community is an assortment of plants that remain stable over a long period of time. Again, bare rock. Pioneer species are the first ones on the scene. In this case, it is going to be lichen and mosses. They break down that bare rock into soil, and then you have grasses, then shrubs, then softwood trees, then hardwood trees. This usually happens after glaciers retreat, lakes dry up, or lava or ash cool. Secondary succession is what happens in resilient ecosystems when you've had a major disturbance. The key difference between primary and secondary succession is primary succession, no soil. Secondary succession, soil. So there you have the same progression as primary, but without lichen being needed to break down rock into soil because you've already got it. This happens after logging, fires, hurricanes, or farming. Hopefully it's clear that secondary succession takes less time than primary succession. An interesting part about secondary succession is oftentimes the new climax community was different than the old growth one, than the one that was from before, which means that all of the other organisms that lived in that old growth forest go extinct. This rate affected by facilitation, inhibition, and tolerance. We'll talk about that later. Okay, we've already talked about what a pioneer species is. So lastly, differentiate between invasives and exotic species. Let's go show you some pretty pictures. Please feel free to stop if you need to. You can see the succession of plants that grow. They go from little dudes to big dudes. And basically, let me go over this again. This is over time, so this is the same area. You come back in 50 years, there's small shrubs. You come back in another 50 years, you've got softwood trees. You come back in another 50 years, and you've got these tall hardwood trees. So that is why it is called succession. Each type of plant is in an orderly fashion succeeded by a new type of plant that's like, thank you for your service, let me kill you, and takes over for them. Same deal with secondary succession. So this is not different places in the forest. This is the same place in the forest. Okay. Differentiate between invasives and exotics. Invasive means that an organism has essentially, quote unquote, taken over an ecosystem. There is nothing there to keep it in check. It has great food sources, no predation, and it can outcompete native species. Alien or exotic just means it's from somewhere else. Native species can become invasive when their system of checks and balances, those environmental resistances on their carrying capacity, are suddenly lifted. Here are some examples of exotic invasives. Fire ants, kudzu, Burmese python, and the zebra mussel that we've already talked about. Kudzu vine, again, you can remember that from class. Here somebody left their car for 2 weeks and now it's covered by the kudzu vine. Here you can actually see this house and an entire forest that has been choked out because of the kudzu and how quickly it grows. Burmese python, upper left-hand corner. This is in the Everglades. This is an actual picture. This is not photoshopped in any way. You can see that in its dying throes, the alligator scratched its way out of the Burmese python. Here you can see, I don't know if you can tell, but this is a hoof that's sticking out of this python. This was in the middle of the road, which is why it's just sitting here on concrete. Lower left-hand corner is a Burmese python that was caught by the patrolman in the Everglades. Here on the lower right-hand corner, a couple of reasons to look at this. This is in New Zealand. This is a python that died after it bit an electrified fence. Please take a look at those impressive teeth. They are hidden until they strike, and you can see that they're backwards curved, and so the more you struggle, the more they set themselves in there. Okay, what is the current range of Burmese pythons? We have them here in Southwest Florida. These are all the areas that are perfectly hospitable to the Burmese python. Something to remember, exotic invasives, the reason they're so successful in the new areas that they're brought to is because they are identical in biomes and conditions as their old home, which means that if you were to put your finger on Florida and then on a globe and then spin the globe, you would eventually end up in Burma. It's at the same same longitude as us. So that's why they're successful here. Oops, it would be very helpful if I made sure I got to all of the questions. Yep, Burmese Python was the last one. Let me make sure I hit all the questions real quick. I think that I did. So hey, we are done.